In this video, we'll be looking at interpreting quantitative information in percents. For our context, we'll use the U.S. illiteracy rates historically, 1870, 1900, 1930, 1940, and 1950. And these are percentages of people over 13 years old who could not read or write in any language. We'd like to look at different ways that we could compare these rates over time and what would be proper sentences that we could use to represent these comparisons. When comparing numbers, we very frequently are setting up fractions. For example, we could take the illiteracy rate in 1870 and compare it to the illiteracy rate 30 years later in 1900, and this quotient equals about 1.869. So there are a few phrases that we could use with this quantity 1.869. We could say that the illiteracy rate in 1870 was 1.869 times higher than the 10.7 was in the year 1900. We could choose to compare those same quantities, but use the reciprocal. Put 10.7 in the numerator and compare it to 20. So we're comparing to the illiteracy rate in 1870. And the quotient equals 0.535. We have different ways that we could use this number. We could turn it into a percent. Lots of times a number that is less than 1 is turned into a percent, and this one would be 53.5%. Now we're comparing it to the rate from 1870. So we would have to say that the rate in 1900 is 53.5% of what it was in 1870. We've compared it back to the illiteracy rate in 1870. So 53.5% is what 1900 is out of the 1870 value. And a quick check shows for sure we're about half, about 50%. And remember the difference when we begin to talk about a percent change, a percent difference, percent higher or lower. This time we need to first figure out the actual amount of the difference. It was a decrease of 9.3 percentage points. And a relative change would mean 9.3 percentage points compared to the rate in 1870, which was 20. And I can tell that it's going to be just about half, a little bit less than half. It's 0.465, so 46.5%. So this actual difference that we see, which we would call percentage points, is an absolute difference. And comparing that absolute difference to one of our original amounts is creating a relative difference. Lastly, I want you to pause the video and try something. I want you to try to come up with some sentences to compare the illiteracy rate in 1940 and 1950. We want to hear some absolute and some relative comparisons, and a variety of sentences using percents. So pause the video and try this for a while, and then you can restart, and I'll try to list as many as I can think of that aren't too crazy or obscure. Comparing the U.S. illiteracy rate in 1940 to the rate in 1950, I have these two offerings for sentences about the absolute differences. The absolute difference would be just the actual difference from subtraction right here, a difference of 0.3%. We'd have to make sure that we refer to these as percentage points to indicate that it's found by subtraction. So the illiteracy rate in 1950 was 0.3 percentage points higher than the rate in 1940. Or, if you switch perspective, then you would say the illiteracy rate in 1940 was 0.3 percentage points lower than the rate in 1950. So a sentence about the absolute difference would need to be something like one of these two, including a 0.3 percentage point difference. We have a few options for sentences about the relative differences. And a relative difference will come from comparing these two numbers in a fraction. Now the wording that I've chosen to use here is actually telling me exactly what my fraction needs to be. It's comparing the illiteracy rate in 1950 compared to 1940, so that means the rate in 1940 needs to be in the denominator. There's the place for the reference value, and the wording this way means compare 1950 to 1940. So I'm starting it off 3.2 over 2.9. It equals about 1.1. So we could have sentences like, the illiteracy rate in 1950 was 1.1 times the rate in 1940. We could say the illiteracy rate in 1950 was 110% the rate in 1940, or 110% of the rate in 1940. These are each indicating that multiply by 1.1 to get from the rate in 1940 to the rate in 1950. Keeping the same idea but just changing our reference value, if we choose to set up the sentence, the illiteracy rate in 1940 was blank, the rate in 1950, now we are comparing to 1950. So now it's compare 2.9% from 1940 to 3.2% from 1950. And this quotient is about 0.91. So that means we could use sentences like, the illiteracy rate in 1940 was 0.91 of the rate in 1950. Or we could see that 0.91 is 91%. The illiteracy rate in 1940 was 91% of the illiteracy rate in 1950. So a couple of sentences that we could use regarding relative changes in the illiteracy rates from 1940 to 1950. If we wanted to use a sentence structure like, the illiteracy rate in 1950 was some percent higher than the rate in 1940, this sort of a relative change means first, find the amount of the change. Again, we know that was a 0.3% increase from 1940 to 1950. And now this sentence is set up to compare this amount of change to 1940. So the change of 0.3% compared to the 1940 rate of 2.9%. As a decimal, 0.103. Okay, so that's about 10.3% higher than what it was in 1940. And we could change our reference value from 1940 to 1950. Now we're comparing this 0.3% difference to the rate from 1950, 3.2. And it's about 9.4%. So using the rate from 1950 as the reference value, 9.4% of that was the decrease to get to what it was in 1940. The illiteracy rate in 1940 was a 9.4% decrease compared to the rate in 1950. So there are a few other options out there, but I think we've hit some of these main patterns about when we should use percent lower and higher, and that we know this is a relative difference. When we're talking about how many times greater or less than, or what percent less than, that's also a relative change that we're finding using a fraction. And absolute changes would be when we're finding just a difference through subtraction. And when we're dealing with percents, we know that we will refer to those as changes in percentage points. Percent changes will always be relative changes that are found with a fraction. And now there's one last concept that we can look at to tie everything together. Let's do a quick recap of different relative differences that we just calculated. We have this one, that the illiteracy rate in 1940 was 9.4% lower than the rate in 1950. And this one, that the illiteracy rate in 1940 was 91% of the rate in 1950. I want to quickly redo these two calculations to keep a few more decimal places. This one was actually 0.90625 exactly. And this division, what percent lower, was actually 0.09375 exactly. And these two statements illustrate a concept that we've seen before. We're looking at a decrease of 9.375% on this sentence, and this is that we're talking about being 90.625% of the rate in 1950. And this is just like when we've talked about a decrease of 15% means the same as looking for 85% of the full price. So a 15% decrease, 100 minus that 15% off, equals your 85%. It's the same thing that's happening here. If you start at 100%, then a decrease of 9.375% equals, you can check it out, 90.625. So what we found in this sentence, the percent of the rate in 1950. So a decrease of 9.375 is the same as finding 90.625%. Just a nice little opportunity to show that something that we've paid attention to in the past still holds true with what we're currently doing with percents.